You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the first of our two episodes devoted to Augustine's Confessions as we interview its translator, Peter Constantine. In part one, we discussed Augustine's life and career and the historical time in which he wrote. We touch on the form of the work, the way it functions as autobiography, science, and biblical commentary. Peter Constantine is the director of the Program in Literary Translation at the University of Connecticut, the publisher of World Poetry Books, and editor-in-chief of the magazine New Poetry in Translation. Constantine is a prolific and award-winning translator whose efforts include works by Thomas Mann, Chekhov, and Isaac Babel. Peter Constantine, welcome to the Norton Library Podcast.
Thank you very much. Well found.
It's such a pleasure to have you to talk about your edition of the Norton Library's Confessions of Augustine. And we always like to start with the writer himself. Who was Augustine? What do we know about him? And what do we need to know about him?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, actually, we have quite a strong image of what he looks like. That is, we think we do. So there are the Botticelli paintings of an ancient man in his cell, writing with a quill. Actually, Botticelli did quite a few paintings. And then there's, the Renaissance Carpaccio as well, Augustine in the Study, and Philippe de Champagne with where Augustine's head is on fire and he's holding a burning heart and he looks up and there's a little cloud where we say Veritas, all these ancient men writing the Confessions. So one thing I'd like to say is we don't know what Augustine looked like. I would like to remind the reader that Augustine was, when he began on his Confessions, he was in his very early 40s. So this ancient sage that has come down to us that we think of when we think of the saint is a sort of a recreation, which we often see with great authors. We see that with Chekhov, for instance, the ancient man. Chekhov was actually one of extremely handsome person, but that did not fit with the image. We see that here with Augustine as well. So that's one thing I'd like to sort of start with. And the second is when you read the Confessions, maybe it's important to think about how they were written. So when Sandro Botticelli paints Augustine with a pen in hand, that's not how it would have happened. Augustine was a great, producer of works, and over 100 books. I think some 500 million words. So he is there's no one from antiquity that we have so much writing from, and the way he could do that, the way he could also preach. When he was Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, the way he could also act as a judge, because that was part of what he would have to do, and still, entertain in the evenings and have these great feasts. The way all that could happen is if there was a sort of a factory, and the factory was scribes, stenographers, copyists, editors. So it was a big production, which we don't think about. We always think of the saint alone in a dark cell writing. Stenographers, because he would speak, he was an orator. He had studied Latin oratory. He was a very, very accomplished Latinist grammarian. He taught before he converted to Christianity. He taught rhetorics. And these inspired books, sermons, letters, and I do say letters because letters were also public. There's a difference between his letters that would have been publicly, let's say, available to those who copied them and had them, and memoranda which were private, which he would also send a private memorandum, and those were not for public consumption. And those are very, very interesting, in fact. So these thousands, and there was much, much more. We don't have everything he wrote. So all of that happened in that way, with scribes and stenographers who quickly could catch every single word.
When did Augustine live, and what would society have been like for him?
So he was born in 354 A.D., and it was at a time when the Roman Empire had recently become Christian. So the Christians were no longer being persecuted because they had been before. He was born in Thagaste, which is in North Africa, in the Kingdom of Numidia at the time. A small town that we don't know very much about. In fact, historians read Confessions very, very carefully and see what he writes about the baths, what he writes about the streets. Anyway, so in that sense, also Confessions is an interesting, historical document that sort of paints a reality of the time. What we often think of that Thagaste being a sort of a backwater province that is at the back of the beyond. However, that's not quite the case. North Africa, which was part of the Roman Empire, was at the time of his birth more central than we think. Rome was having some serious problems. It was being attacked by barbarians, as one would say. So it was pretty much the end of the Roman Empire was nigh. So they were very, very colorful, interesting, problematic, and dangerous times. And it was to catch up with Augustine later on, when, in fact, when he died, which was in 430, he had quite a long life. So in 430 of the modern era, they were being besieged, and that was the end of Hippo, which was the town, which then became the capital of a new sort of barbarian empire, as the Romans would have said.
What kind of impact did his Confessions have when he was alive? How would it have been disseminated and shared at that time?
The scribes would have created the copies. And when I say copies, I mean quite a few. Another important thing to think about is really to try and sort of teleport oneself back to a time. I will say something. It sounds a bit crude, but let's say no internet. Okay. No publishing, no books. Some bookstores, but the books were extraordinarily expensive because they were handcrafted. It was also a period that was very, very important, to transition from scrolls to books, to codex, which looked like the books that we have today. Now, scrolls were very difficult to read because you had to also, and writing, to write on a scroll, in fact, when scribes were still writing on scrolls, you'd have one holding the scroll up, and the other one dipping into ink, and but also the paper would have to be created, the parchment would have to be created, the ink would have to be created. Hence, also this big factory kind of situation. But for a book to exist, it wasn't just that Augustine, let's say, would sit in his study and write the book, and then we have it and it's sent out for publication. The reason there were so many scribes around are that many versions were created. So that was one thing, and that was the first bit of dissemination. And then Posidius, who was also his first biographer and very good friend, who worked very, very hard during the final years of Augustine, but also afterward, to ensure that the libraries with all the books would survive the invasions, the barbarian invasions, the burning of libraries. So what I would like to say there is it was a production with many copies being created for people who would have to have these books and maybe also read them out.
Yeah, I'm also interested in his influence and legacy in the sense that, so this is 1600 years of this text being extant. Has his influence wavered over the years, come and gone, or has this text consistently been canonical and important and cited?
Yes, I would say until the 19th, early 20th century, it was without question canonical and fully embraced, and interestingly, not just by the Catholic Church, but also Protestant, which is something to be kept in mind. So he was not, he was not boarded out, or let's say he was not cut out of Britain's reality or Germany's reality with Luther or with the Reformation in the United Kingdom. So that's one thing to be kept in mind. Questions started being asked, I think, in the 20th century about certain things, like maybe, the way women are presented in confessions and in other writings. That is one thing. So feminist reading. I think also the doctrines were to some extent discussed a bit more openly. So yes, but still very, very influential. Both Augustine, his mother, Santa Monica. So she was a major saint in the Christian church and revered also throughout the millennium.
Peter, in your introduction to the Norton Library edition of Augustine's Confessions, you mentioned that one of the immediate challenges for a reader is the problem of genre. You see a title like Confessions and you say, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be a tell-all autobiography. But it seems like it's a lot more complicated than that. Can you talk a little bit about the genre of this book?
Yes. So first of all, Confessions is an interesting title. I like the title, although there are scholars, theologians who would prefer testimony. Or who would like something a bit more nuanced. Nuanced in the sense that Confessions, what do we think of is that it is a sinner who is confessing. But that's not really, maybe partially true, also partially how Augustine would present himself. But he is testifying his conversion. He's testifying that it is so clear when you look at the world how God is good. So that's his. I think that's something that we should think about a little bit. Definitely, the title is to be kept in mind a little bit as we read. I would also say that we will notice that it even if it isn't really an autobiography, it has always been perceived as such, and also started a Western tradition of autobiography. We see very similar structures, let's say, in Rousseau's Confessions. Also an autobiography, and there's sort of little hints of. Rousseau will say, "This is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. What I write." So Augustine stole apples with his naughty friends. Rousseau stole pears. So, and in a sense, both are really symbolic, and that's something to be kept in mind, that maybe some of the passages are fictionalized in order to make a point. That, for instance, in the stealing of the pears that Augustine writes about, they were not very good pears. He had access to much better pears. He didn't have to do that, but he just did it because his friends did it, and he sort of mixed with the wrong crowd. So it's might say even parable in a sense.
Yes. Is there an element to the confessions, and confessions might take also a secular term, so it might mean something a little bit more modern?
Well, yes, and maybe that is what has made this book so fascinating throughout the, let's say, millennia, is that it can be read in so many different ways. And if you've read Confessions more than once, you might almost feel you're reading a different book. And there is something for everyone in it. It is a fascinating story. There are those insights, historical insights that I pointed to. There are those problematic presentations of slaves, being beaten, how women must negotiate their lives in order to prevail, within a male-dominated society. And maybe the question of is he condoning that in the book? So as you read that might be something that might strike you. I would not say, I would prefer not to have such a presentist reading. We should remember that it is written within a society, of the 300s and 400s AD, so that is it is part of a reality, but that could also be seen as an apologist stance, because we could also say slavery in the States was a reality 200 years ago. Why didn't certain people speak up? So. But I would leave that up to the reader to decide, where that is, like how they might feel or engage with that.
How does the problem of genre that we're discussing go along with just the layout of the book? If you look at the chapters that Augustine gives us, it doesn't seem completely coherent, or is it completely coherent?
I would say yes and no. First of all, the way the books, the way they're laid out, come from the codexes that have come down to us. So that was imposed by later editors. I don't know to what extent he perceived these as different books. I'm not aware of that. And over the last 10 years of working with Augustine in different ways, I've never come across that. So we respond, let's say the translator responds to the codexes that we have. They were laid out in this form. Now, from book 1 to book 9, we have really the autobiography, as it were, and then after that, an exegesis, in other words, a look and a study of Genesis and more philosophical terms. You will see in college courses that when Augustine is taught, there seems to be a tendency to teach books 1 to 9 or 1 to 10, and not to do the very last ones because they are quite hard reading. For, I would say, particularly for undergraduates. However, if you do read from cover to cover, you will see that, initially you might go, what happened? Why is there this gear change suddenly? Why are we at this different speed? But then looking back, you will see that he is just explaining, and maybe there's also a key to the fact that Confessions is there to help people of the time find Christianity and true Christianity, not a heretical, not a heresy, as the Manichaeans or the Donatists, at the time who he fought, or the pagan portions or demi-pagan portions, let's say, of his flock or of people who would come to his sermons. So Confessions was maybe also an example, like, this is what I did, and this is how I look at things, and this is how I found God, and this should maybe help you do the same.
You mentioned the stealing of the fruit. That's a famous episode of the Confessions. What are other touchstone episodes that Augustine tells us about, and why are they important? What should we be looking for?
There's a controversial passage, the death of his close friend. Controversial, I would say. I wouldn't, maybe I wouldn't want to call it controversial. It's clear that the excessive mourning at the death of his friend, he then uses as an example of what is wrong. Before he found God, he could not, he was too bound to earthly matters. And there's a contrast to when his mother dies or when his son dies, that they're dealt with in a sort of very, very emotional but cool way, not in this over the top. Maybe I'm using the wrong language, but this over the top that I've just said now is what people have also thought of as possibly being a homoerotic relationship, and it has also sparked in the 20th century sort of question of whether he felt that he was sinning with male friends. I'm not sure I necessarily want to touch on that because it's not central to the book, and it's clearly not his intention. So that's more of a reading that people might do. But that episode is quite dramatic. Terrible depression, and he can't go. He looks at places where he and his friend have been, and he can't be there. He can't see them. So it's actually a spectacular description of grief. So that's one thing. I think another thing I've always found interesting was that when he decides to make his fortune in Italy, and even though his mother Monica is very, very is a sort of central figure also for his conversion to Christianity, because Monica was a Christian and Patricius, his father, was pagan. So he came from a mixed family. Augustine came from a mixed family like that, and so he was not. It was only later in Italy that he was baptized, that he became Christian. So he was sort of a demi-Christian in those years. But he escaped with his concubine, whose name he doesn't name. He calls her Una, one person. But she was important to him, and when we do the math by reading Confessions, we see that she bore him a son when he was 16 or 17. So it's something else but he was faithful to her, he also says. And they were a family, despite her status as a concubine, and raised a Deodatus, which is given by God. God sent is the name of his son. They raised him together and also left together secretly, it seems, because they did not want to take Monica along to Italy, where he was going to go first of all to Rome and then to Milan. Milan was where the emperor was, and he became a rhetorician there. And he would have traveled, with his family, slaves, and arrived in Rome, and then move on to Milan. So those are all very, very interesting biographical moments in Confessions that I'd suggest to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, that's great. So Confessions has 13 books, and I'm wondering, Peter, if there's one book that you think is particularly dramatic or you enjoy talking about the most that maybe we could focus on.
Book 9 is very interesting because it is a lot happens. This is where Christianity is embraced, but also from a biographical perspective, which I find very interesting, is he describes his mother. In fact, I'd like to maybe read a few lines from that.
Sure.
Because it sort of shows what we were talking about a little bit before, about the problem of position of women in Roman society, not only in North Africa, but also throughout the Roman Empire. From that book, he discusses the relationship between his mother and his father. And he writes, she tolerated his infidelity so that there would never be any animosity between them. For she was awaiting your mercy upon him, that in believing in you he might become chaste. Furthermore, he was as exceptionally kind as he was hot-tempered. But she had learned not to cross an angry husband in word or deed. It was only when his temper had settled and he was calm and approachable that she would explain her actions if he had happened to be too quick to flare up in anger. Many other wives, who had gentler husbands, bore shameful marks of beatings on their faces, and among their friends would blame their husbands' ways. But she would blame the women's tongues, giving the women, as if in jest, the solemn advice that the instant they had heard the marriage contract read out to them, they should have recognized that they were now slaves. And remembering their station, it would have been more fitting for them not to take on airs before their lords. When their friends found out what a violent husband she had, they were amazed that nobody had ever heard of Patricius raising a hand to her, or that she never bore the marks of a beating. So that's quite a poignant passage, I think, that sort of bears looking at and maybe thinking about, within context. And he also talks about the slaves that had raised his mother. There was an elderly slave who was very, very hard on her, would not let her or her sisters drink water in order to discipline them. I regret one thing in my translation. So famula is a word for maid servant, or slave. And now these were slaves, and I should have translated it as such. So I translated them as maids. But when Monica marries into the family of Patricius, and the slave women intrigue against her, the young slave women, she manages to assert herself by speaking to her mother-in-law, and the slaves are beaten, and will be beaten until they follow the until they see sense. So in Augustine's works, the elderly women slaves usually are the sort of motherly figures. The younger ones are the intriguers. Maybe what I'm just saying now is extremely controversial, and I should not really be saying it. Maybe. But it is something that I have noticed, and something that your translators will often think, "Oh, I should have done something slightly different." I'm happy to say it hasn't happened too often with Augustine, but that is one thing where I wonder if I sort of ironed things out a little bit.
Book 9 also talks about his baptism.
Yes.
And is there something about the description or his recollection of his baptism that might be striking?
It is touching that he was baptized with his son and with his friend also Alypius, who then, if we read the letters of Augustine later on, Alypius, who was also bishop in Numidia, had a similar trajectory to Augustine. That the three of them, there was an important bond. It is the high point of Confessions in many ways, that the whole book moves toward that moment, and the fact that it is with his son and his best friend, I think, is an interesting and important moment as well.
You also make a point in your introduction about the notion of Manichaeism and how that relates to Augustine.
one of the tasks that Confessions has is to shut the door on Augustine, for him to shut the door on his past as a rhetorician, first of all. I mean, somebody could use language to persuade people, and generally to persuade them to do whatever one wants them to do, which is just so wrong from his perspective. But he was also a Manichaean for 9 years. And the thing about Manichaeans was that it was a form of Christianity. It just was considered a heresy. That there were heretical parts to the way the Manichaeans saw good and evil. It was very much of an intellectual religion with strong philosophical arguments that had initially attracted Augustine. So in the Confessions, we see a sort of a damning of that, and his confessing, or his testimony that this was a very, very wrong thing, a wrong period, that he had been lost and now was found. He then also, if we look at the correspondence afterwards, after the Confessions were written, they were completed around 400. So he lived, another 30 years after they were done. So he, many of the writings and many of the letters are defense against. Well, the profession. I'm not a Manichae. I have nothing to do with that. It is not, valid part of anything that I have any connection to, because he was still being accused.
Peter Constantine, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Augustine's Confessions.
Thank you very much.
The Norton Library edition of Augustine's Confessions, translated by Peter Constantine, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.